Hey friends, this is Joseph Maynor. So happy Christmas, happy Christmas Eve for those of you who celebrate these holidays. If not, for those of you, this is a happy time for me and for other people in the West. And so we are in a kind of daze, due to this holiday, just like any other culture might experience a holiday. So, what I want to do in this video is I want to do the inverse of my last video to show how, a lot of development work does rely on theory, right? Otherwise, you don't know whether you're coming or going, right? You don't have a knowing. And knowing is important, right? A lot of people really express the virtue of knowing, but also we realize too, like with every virtue, it can lead to a vice, something that Aristotle understood. Too much of something turns bad, although for a lot of people, like not enough of something is bad too. You got to realize that. So before you criticize Stage Orange, realize that India is one of the poorest countries in the world, right? That's not a bug, that's a feature. And they're catching up with the Stage Orange thing. But the reality is like you can have too much spirituality to the exclusion of the finite, and you can have too much of the finite to the exclusion of spirituality. It's like a chess game that's just ongoing. And some of the most sustainable, intricate cultures in the world have figured out a nonlinear but also linear way of marrying these issues of finite leadership with infinite renunciation or infinite detachment. So what I want to do in this video is I want to talk about the inverse of the last video, which was focused on the finite or the human. And I did not intend that video to necessarily reduce to Stage Red or Stage Orange, but I realize a lot of people have traumas with regard to these, and so they're going to dish out the same abuse they suffered while pretending like they're opposite to their shadow, right? So for example, if you have a lot of Stage Red trauma, you're probably going to have the human in your shadow to a certain extent because you view the human as an aspect of your trauma. If you're somebody who's always been in the divine, right, you're going to have that in your shadow because that's your strength. You don't need to work on that. What you need to work on is being more Stage Red or being more Stage Orange, which is not bad. So it's almost like there is no universal self-help teacher. There can't be, because depending on what your profile of strengths and weaknesses are, depending on what you experienced in life, is going to dictate how much you dip into something versus something else. And no one finite perspective can cover all that. And therefore, we need something that we might call the infinite. And so spirituality is born, right? Spirituality is a leveling up from the finite. And this is why spirituality and religion actually don't compete, right? They're two totally different things. I firmly believe that, you can be religious and spiritual at the same time, right? This idea that spirituality is somehow cut off from religion, that would make spirituality a finite thing. And because of the fact that spirituality is not a finite thing, it's an infinite thing, it makes it the lowest human value. But when you flip those values around, it becomes the highest value. We're not sure whether to call it human or not, right? We get into this kind of confusion now about maybe we reject things that we formerly accepted. So in the last video for the human, I basically stated 7 values as follows: accountability, and then number 1, number 2, health, finances, relationships, number 2, number 3, action, energy, number 4, knowledge, number 5, creativity, number 6, happiness, number 7, spirituality. So you can see that from a finite perspective, spirituality is at the bottom. Because when we're identified with the finite perspective, we're looking out for ourselves as a finite perspective. Right? The reactive moral ego, the teacher, and the condescension, right? Because anytime you're teaching something, that's a finite perspective. See? Right? The focus on like the opposite of human love is someone building an argument against you and or colluding against you and or excluding you, right? We want to survive as a teacher in the finite. Like, that's ego. And there's nothing wrong with ego necessarily, although we can put it into question. And actually that's what happens when we flip the values around, when we flip the egoic values around or the finite values around to the infinite. It inverts it. And so now we put our own ego into question. This is, I think, what a lot of people don't do, right? Because they have to be a teacher. They have to be the truth teller as a finite perspective. They don't realize that, like, spirituality is all about, like, an escape of that game on some level. Why? Because you don't know who you are or what you are entirely in language or in attachment. Being is not, as Heidegger understood, being is not capturable in a kind of narrative. Being is more fundamental than that. So in other words, like, it's not about you, it's as a finite perspective, it's not about you as an infinite perspective. It's not about the other as a finite perspective. It's not about the other as an infinite part of the infinite or an infinite perspective. Like, all of that is just noise in the machine, so to speak. And the machine is not you entirely. In part it is, right? You're engaged in the dream. You're engaged in the movie. You like your character in the movie, right? You want to be the hero in the movie. But that's ego, right? That's the other side. That's the light side of the moon. So now we're talking about the dark side of the moon. We're flipping everything around. In a way, it's weird. The light side of the moon is very kind of human masculine. The dark side of the moon is very divine feminine. So the light side of the moon is all about, like, showing up well in the dream as a character in the dream. The dark side of the moon is more about allowing the illusion to persist and realizing that on some level you are not, right, a character on the light side of the moon. Actually, you're the awareness that is really doing nothing and not even. 2. How could we have this paradox, right? But then you may say to yourself, well, this is just a feature of the mind too. Like, thinking in terms of paradox is a feature of the mind. I agree with that on some level, because we can remain silent. And as we remain silent, there's no problem, right? This goes away. And I'll explain when we go through the model, the inverse of the human and the shift in polarity there to talk about the divine. It's actually very interesting how the divine makes sense of the human. And this is a wonderful reframe, actually, because it will give you a totally different context on yourself and on others so that you can kind of move into stage turquoise, maybe. Stage coral, stage teal. Coral and teal are my extended stages, but you will see that this conflict between the human and the divine and not even is good. It's not something to try to avoid. It's there's lessons here. I think there's like general lessons too. I don't know. Maybe this is just my ego, like wanting to be the teacher, right? Anytime you're identifying with being the teacher, right, you got to look at that one. Be careful. Okay, make sure that what you're saying is grounded in sharing what you do as opposed to like lecturing other people about ideals that maybe you don't fit. And that's hard for everyone. Everybody realizes that. And that's why identifying with the teacher can actually be a trap. Because the reality will react against you, like karma will react against you in that sense and expose you for doing that, right? For basically kind of huffing your own farts as a teacher role. Like you're too attached to being a teacher. You don't know how to just like share in a kind of humble way, which is, interestingly, paradoxically, the most powerful way that you can share. So it doesn't seem like that though, right? It doesn't seem like that. It seems like the most powerful way to share is to be like super like pushy and like act like a celebrity about what you're saying, right? So let's go through these. Let's start with spirituality as number 1, happiness as number 2, creativity as number 3, knowledge as number 4, action and energy as number 5, health, finances, relationships as number 6, and accountability as number 7. So, to give you guys some insights on spirituality, I would say that the topics in spirituality that I think are really useful for teaching and for being are truth, love, peace, insight, and power. And how these are reframed. So when spirituality becomes the number 1 value, you may think in terms of like being in truth or truth in being, but this is really just an attempt to merge, right, concepts. But merging concepts doesn't often give us really like a lot of illumination intellectually in terms of understanding. Sometimes like it's better to like take one concept and work with it, and then take another concept and work with it, and then you can talk about integrating those, right? But after you've seen either one, it's like trying to teach people, middle game theory in chess before they've really worked on openings and defenses. Like, I think Fisher Random kind of tries to do this, right? It tries to get rid of the focus on openings and defenses and just start with the middle game. Right? And that's cool, right? That's a way to like cut off like part of the problem. But like if you want to play chess, you really do need to become fascinated with openings, right? Just like if you want to play good Minecraft, you really do need to become fascinated with the possibilities in terms of the physics of Minecraft or the rules of Minecraft. So, but spirituality, when we talk about truth, we're not talking about philosophy. We're talking about being. And we're talking about also understanding being. So it's the body and the mind, and neither. So metaphysics exists in spirituality, but we don't call it philosophy. We might call it Indian philosophy, we might call it spirituality, but philosophy generally is not, in the West anyway, or even in Chinese philosophy, like keenly focused on issues of the self. That's more like Indian philosophy. So in spirituality, we're focused on the issue of the self and the other and neither. And that brings up issues of truth, that brings up with a capital T, that brings up issues of love with a capital L, peace with a capital P, insight with a capital I, and power with a capital P. So spirituality is a way, it's the inverse of the human, right? And to have this kind of experience is what we mean by spirituality. I mean, at least what is what I mean by spirituality. What Joseph Maynor means by spirituality, right? See, there's not a lot of people who are sharing who really give that caveat. Like, this is just my opinion, right? No, they want to like state their opinion like it's some kind of universal truth, which is the feigning of the teacher. Right? The didactic nature of the teacher is like, I'm the teacher, you're the student, right? You got to listen to me. But if you really want to learn spirituality, you got to realize like listening is already an attachment. So there's this this issue of detachment, which moves us into number 2, happiness. So notice that, like when we talked about the human, knowledge, creativity, and happiness were skewed toward the finite perspective. So knowledge was equivalent to truth, which was kind of equivalent to like pragmatism or philosophy. Creativity, right, has something to do with survival. And happiness reduces to my happiness or my people's happiness, my tribe's happiness, the people who I'm connected with, their happiness. So it's localized sort of, right? But if you look at the divine, we have happiness, creativity, and knowledge. But notice that like happiness, it has a shift in polarity, and so does creativity, and so does knowledge. So I'll explain these as follows. So value number 1 for the divine is spirituality. Okay, so we talked about truth, love, peace, insight, and power. Now, number 2, happiness. The concept here, or the pointer here that I can give you guys, is detachment, right? There's something about like recognizing the limitations of the ego in terms of attaining happiness and realizing that happiness is much deeper, but it results from a kind of detachment, whether it's a divine feminine attachment in the sense that you realize you're just a finite piece of the whole, or whether it's a divine masculine detachment where you realize that I am that which perceives the whole. Either way, there's a detachment from ego, or a detachment from the finite perspective that is characteristic of divine happiness. So how about number 3, creativity? Notice that for the human, we put knowledge ahead of creativity, but for the divine, we're going to put creativity ahead of knowledge. And this is like significant for a lot of you, right? This is going to solve a lot of your guys' issues with regard to how knowledge should be treated in spirituality because of this role reversal between creativity and knowledge, as opposed to how knowledge and creativity were flipped around the other way in my last video when we talked about the human. So for the divine, creativity, if we can come up with the concept that would kind of grab this one, I think. somewhat by the balls, but maybe not. Maybe it grabs it by the heart. I don't know, right? Or the brain. But I think the issue is karma, right? For creativity. Karma means absolute infinity. It means that creation is infinite. So even you watching this video and listening to me, this is a finite perspective that I'm giving you. It's like eating a Milky Way bar, right? Or drinking a Coke, or eating McDonald's, or wearing, some kind of high fashion garment or something like that. Like, it's an identification, it's a relation. What I'm saying is not the infinite at all. I'm watching myself on a screen. I'm the infinite watching the finite, but I'm also the finite intuiting or feeling the infinite too. And neither, and not even. But look, if we're going to talk, we got to be interesting, right? We got to say something. I mean, unless you just want to say Om, right? You're just like, Om. Om. How many people do you think are going to follow you online? There's no drama there. There's no narrative there. There's no story. That we're all addicted to narratives. Even people who think that they're really woke, on some level, like they're addicted to some kind of narratives, some subset of narratives. They like a certain kind of music, right? They like a certain kind of treatment. They have proclivities, which makes them finite. But the little you is not entirely you. So creativity from a divine perspective is not about trying to gain some kind of a result. It's more about exploring creativity itself and the nature of creativity, and how the finite you is also a factor in this nature of creativity. Kind of like Spinoza's account of the absolute infinity. You're a mode of God, but you are not God for Spinoza. You're a part. So he's giving an account of the jiva from an absolute perspective. But what Spinoza doesn't understand is that you can step back in terms of the mind as well, not just being, not just body, but mind as well, and find this piece of consciousness that doesn't exist in the finite either, that doesn't exist in karma. And therefore, you can identify with that piece of consciousness that doesn't exist in karma or in the changing absolute infinity space. And that makes you impart, it gives you a ground for detachment that is spiritual, because you realize that I am trumps it is, or being. I am trumps being. Because for being to exist, there's got to be something that perceives it. And so therefore, it's obvious that there's a piece of consciousness that sits outside of being. So that's the divine masculine. So we have creativity. So 1 was spirituality, 2 was happiness, detachment, turiya, right? Happiness, turiya. Turiya means peace. Turiya means you can watch the movie and watch yourself in the movie and not get so reactive about it, not get so judgmental about it. Not get so judgmental about the movie either, because you realize that the movie is not entirely real. In part it is, because you're focused on it, right? And that's the human. That's why we have the human. That's why we have the finite. People who try to duck out in the infinite to the exclusion of the finite, I think they're like they're gonna get a reality check. The finite is here to school your finite. I mean, check out not my last video, but the video before that where I talked about how the infinite schools the finite. So notice that like knowledge in the spiritual direction is about pointers. It's not about telling you what's what, because nobody can do your spirituality for you. Nobody can solve the issue of self for another person. So knowledge is not philosophy, it's not pragmatism, it's pointers. It's on you to like find out what spirituality is. So that's why I say that knowledge, creativity, happiness, or happiness, creativity, knowledge, there's a shift in polarity of those from the human and the divine. So in the divine, those are shifted more toward the individual finite perspective. And in the human, they're shifted more toward the individual finite perspective. And in the divine, they're shifted more toward the infinite perspective. Now, let's talk about 2, 3, 4, 5. Action and energy. Well, this, from a spirituality perspective, this could be like your meditation, your spiritual practice, whatever that might be. Like, so the chakras model, yoga, right? That's what like action and energy are, because you realize that from an absolute perspective, you're not entirely a finite perspective. And so a lot of it is practicing like openness and dissolution of attachment and remaining calm and kind of allowing things to emerge that are good, as opposed to like strive drive, like a stage orange kind of strive drive, or a stage red manipulation, or a stage blue white knight moralism, or a stage green kind of hatred of everything that is powerful almost, or a stage yellow kind of intolerance of chaos, and the inverse of being a thinker, right? Like the feminine can always trump the masculine by saying, I don't accept the mind, right? And the masculine is left like with no argument. See? So look out for that one too. That's a finite perspective, that reality is going to serve that up to you on a silver platter. If you're an intellectual, reality will serve that up to you over and over again on a silver platter. Like, look at this one, dude. Look at this one, dude. Right? Accountability. That's the weakest. So from a spiritual perspective, that's number 7. Yeah, spiritual people, they don't like accountability. Because they don't really want to identify with being a finite perspective. And so they're going to view human self-help as being an error. But I'll say this about these people. Oftentimes these people they have a strength there. And that's why they are popular as spiritual teachers, because they are the kind of huckster type, right? So they have that in spades. That's why they're not aching for it. So you got to realize that like people who have something, they're not going to be pushing for that because they already got it. They're going to be pushing for what they need to heal themselves, which is usually the no ego stuff. So, don't expect most spiritual gurus to teach you very much about accountability. You got to flip more into the other direction. Like, watch my last video on the finite to really work on accountability. Just like if you're in the finite, you're not going to work very much on spirituality, right? It's like if you're in Minecraft and you're just focused on speed running through the whole game, you're going to be killing animals left and right. You're going to be looting from villages. You're going to be doing all these things because your focus is only on success. See? So, but you can see how the inverse of that extreme is like allowing everything to be here and not seeing that, you're not taking any accountability at all. You don't have a value for accountability. You can't, right? So there's got to be a marriage between these. And in fact, there is, right? So, but I was glad to be able to look at both sides as like sides of a coin, and then realize that that's really just a pointer too, because the sides are really just theories, and the coin is really just a theory or a pointer. And so, but all of this is just coming from my perspective to give you something to consider that may or may not alchemically resonate with your life, right? So I can share that. I feel a need to share that for some reason. Okay, friends? Hopefully this was a good video, and Merry Christmas to all of you, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.